Well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. I'm Ivo Dollar, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's a great pleasure to have so many people here and joining us for this on-the-record live stream program. And just to remember, all of you, if you can silence your phones and continue to participate in the conversation online, that's great. It's a particular delight to welcome a set of very distinguished guests here to the council. 5 mayors, Mayor Rahm Emanuel, of course, from Chicago, Mayor Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C., Mayor Hector Insua from Colima City in Mexico, Mayor Valerie Plante from Montreal, and Mayor Gregor Robertson from Vancouver. These mayors, together with some 50 other mayors from around the world, are gathered here in Chicago today as part of the North America Climate Summit that is being convened by the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy over the next few days. We at the Council on Global Affairs are especially pleased to be able to host this public event. And in recent years, the Council has become the go-to place for discussions and research and analysis on the role of global cities, a role that is becoming ever more important as national governments prove unable to forge the required consensus necessary for addressing the rising number of global challenges, of which climate change is probably the most important. Cities like Chicago, its residents, its businesses, and its leadership are stepping up, and coalitions like the Global Covenant of Mayors are key to facilitating the kinds of cooperation among cities to implement global agreements, including the Paris Agreement on climate change. Our program this afternoon is that we will feature opening remarks from Mayor Emanuel to be followed by a panel discussion, and I'm extremely pleased that to moderate that panel today, Tom Friedman has joined us. Of course, Tom, a New York Times columnist, 3-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 6 best-selling books, including his latest, Thank You for Being Late. And now it is my pleasure to welcome to the stage Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who gathered all of the mayors here today for this important event. Mayor Emanuel.
Thank you. Thank you, Davo. Thank you all for being here. Let me also say just one correction. It's not that national governments don't have a consensus. It is when national governments and their leaders are in denial. There are only 2 people that do not believe there are climate change. One is at 1600 at Pennsylvania Avenue, and the other one's at the EPA. So outside of that, there's a consensus among everybody else. And just for everybody to know, the city of Chicago is honored to host 51 mayors representing over 60 million people from 10 different countries, all here in the city of Chicago. And the goal, as I know for all those that are from Chicago, it doesn't come as a shock. I'm not a very patient person, and Gregory, my good friend, knows from Vancouver. So this is not about symbolism. We're committed, all of us, to the Paris protocols. These are the Chicago charters. There will be very specific plans per city, different, each plan different, but how each city will get on its way to achieving the Paris protocols through the Chicago charters, and making sure that we actually accomplish that goal. The plan for Chicago will be different than the plan for Vancouver, which will be different than the plan for Montreal, or different from the plan from Washington, D.C. But everybody will get to 2025 Paris protocols and the consensus to reduce their emissions. Now, I do say that, and I'm proud that the city of Chicago can host this. We have our own record. It's also an objective of ours to make sure that it's relevant to people, meaning the city of Chicago, prior to becoming mayor, was the only city in the United States that still had 2 coal-fired power plants operating in the city. We have shut those down. They no longer operate in the city of Chicago. And it also, as I remind you, saves money, because the kids around Pilsen and back of the yards, a little village that live near those plants, were always at the emergency room. So don't anybody ever convince you that this actually costs money. We also, as a city, save $12 million a year on energy costs because of our retrofit plan. So you can not only grow jobs, be healthier, but actually also save money. And our goal is, as a city, is when you have leadership that is absent, as they stand down, cities will stand up. We're not only the leaders in the kind of what I say, the economic, intellectual, and cultural space of the country and the global economy is metropolitan centers. But we're going to be leaders in national policy that we know for the short term and the long term is in our interests. And I'm proud that I always refer to Chicago as the most American of American cities. You're in the heartland of America that will actually, if we do the right things in the next 2 to 3 years, our cities and our residents will be stronger for the next 20 to 30 years. I am proud that, and I can say this to my colleagues that are here from around both the United States, Canada, and Mexico. I know what it's like to take a day or day and a half out of your schedule and go somewhere else. So I want to thank all of my friends and my colleagues from around the North American 3 respective countries. Taking time out of their schedule, I will tell you, is a commitment that goes, they're not here because we're going to drop 30 degrees in weather over the night, okay? And if you don't believe there's climate change, I was running in December yesterday on Lake Michigan on the lakefront path. It was 62 in shorts. Tomorrow night, it's dropping 30 degrees. So just go ahead outside if you don't believe there's climate change. It's happening, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? Not whether it's happening, but what we collectively do to take care of it. And the commitment of time and the commitment of energy and the commitment of ideas, and we all as mayors all learn from each other. So I want to thank, ahead of schedule, my 4 friends and colleagues for being here, the other mayors that are here. Tom Friedman is just visiting family here. We're just an excuse for him to visit family. Okay, and nobody knows this, but his daughter actually babysitted my children when I was in Washington. And so I'm allowed to take a free shot at the father of our favorite babysitter. But I want to thank Tom also for taking time out of his schedule to be here, because the 60 million people we all collectively represent are going to be safer, healthier, and better off because we're doing the hard things that are necessary for the future. Thank you.
Oh, I'm here? Okay, sorry. When the music stops, whoever doesn't have a chair is no longer mayor.
I think we're going here. Sorry. Thank you.
Well, what a treat. And thanks, Mayor Emanuel, and to Ivo for giving me this honor to be with these great mayors and wrestling with this giant topic, you know, and Ram really alluded to it. It's what I like to call global weirding, because that's actually what happens. The weather doesn't just get warmer, it actually gets weird. The hots get hotter, the wets get wetter, the colds get colder, the dries get drier. In this age where at least America has abdicated any sort of national leadership on this subject, obviously the role of mayors becomes very important in our country, but I know worldwide. And I just want to start by giving everyone the same question to start with, which is, so why are you here now? And that why are cities and mayors becoming such critical players in our achieving certainly the goals laid out in the Paris Agreement? Mayor Bowser, you want to start?
Well, certainly. Well, first, thank you all for being here to talk about a very important topic. In Washington, D.C., I joined the C40 Global Collection of Mayors just a couple of years ago to talk with my peers around the world about what we could do collectively. Our city has been very focused on the environment and building sustainable practice for a number of years. And in fact, just this year, we were named the first LEED Platinum City anywhere in the world. So we've been very focused with our building practices, with how we use energy, with our focus on our waterways at making our environment better. But it became very clear to me when I was elected that we as mayors, the type of buying decisions that we're making, how we regulate our built space, really puts us in the driver's seat for a lot of decisions. And last November, it became increasingly important for us to speak up around the world about the American commitment to fighting climate change.
Mayor Roberts.
Well, yeah, I think echoing Mayor Bowser's words, local action is critical. That's where the solutions are being delivered. And as mayors, we're charged with the responsibility to act and deal with the impacts that we're facing, which are very real, right? This week in Vancouver, we have what are now called king tides, which are the highest tides of the year. And as the sea level is rising, we're seeing the water come right up over our seawalls, flooding into neighborhoods in Vancouver.
Was this the first year it happened, or you've seen that gradually
We've seen it over the last couple of years, and it's twice a year that the tides are at their highest points.
Fascinating.
And we estimate about a $10 billion investment to keep the ocean at bay over the next couple of decades. That's a rough ballpark for our region. But it's a very, very significant cost to taxpayers and impacts we felt last summer with forest fires. We live in a rainforest, and now unprecedented.
Yeah.
2 out of the last 3 summers, we've had fires close enough to Vancouver to actually turn our air into smoky mess, which we have the cleanest air of any big city in the world, typically. That's what we're used to. And that's decades of focus to reduce our air pollution, clean up the air. And then when we get that coming back in because of climate change and forest burning nearby, the impacts are very real, and people are really demanding action. If we're not seeing enough of it at a national level, and to be fair, their actions don't directly impact cities often. We have to take that action locally, but we can't be at odds with federal, state, provincial governments in terms of phasing out fossil fuels as soon as humanly possible. To protect our planet and our people. So we've got to take action. We've got to bind together these really unprecedented cooperation between cities and communities around the world to deliver on the solutions and the actions that we need, and to call the BS on the other governments when they're not taking action or when they're in denial altogether.
I'm going to go to you, Mayor Plant, in 1 second, but I want to go back to you, Mayor Brown. I want everyone to answer this question that Mayor Robertson raised. Do you actually see things happening now in Washington, D.C. that tell you the climate's changing, like Mayor Robertson said, with sea level rise? Obviously, we don't have that in D.C. per se, but
well, we do.
Actually, there are.
We're actually we haven't focused on flooding in our city, and just because of the way we're laid out and how our city's built, kind of going up the hill. But recently, as part of our resilience strategy, we have been more focused on flooding and what flooding can do to our city. What we have seen, similar to what Mayor Emanuel talked about, is just wild swings in our temperature and not being able to predict from winter to winter what we're going to get. Yes.
Mayor Plant, both questions. So what are you seeing in Montreal, and why is this coming to cities?
So why it's important to be here, because it is our responsibility. We're at the front line, dealing with our citizens, our population, dealing with climate change on a very direct way, and flooding is one of the impacts. So Montreal is an island, and so we've had episodes of flooding, but also we have now more and more heat waves. Our winters have changed dramatically. We have less snow. It has a big impact not only on the public health, but also on day-to-day situation or project like or the icing rings we have, how we manage our streets. So it's interesting because all that has an impact, again, on the very logistic side of things, but also on the quality of life of our population. So it is our duty, it is our responsibility. And I'm so glad to be here, because more and more cities have to play a predominant role in telling, in sharing to the other level of government how important it is. And we need to be part of the discussion on what needs to be done in terms of objectives and some of the resources that needs to be given to us. Of course, the states in Canada and Mexico are different, but there's still this a partnership that needs to happen between the different levels in terms of resources and, again, of objectives.
Answer both questions. What have you seen? I know your city, Colima, is on the west coast of Mexico, and all you've had are hurricanes, earthquakes, volcano. Are there any plagues we've missed? Go ahead.
Primero que nada, muchísimas gracias. Un saludo.
First of all, thank you very much for being here.
Comparto con mis colegas la importancia de que desde lo local empecemos a tomar acciones coordinadas y conjuntas.
I share with my colleagues that we can take opinions and we can work together.
Y hacer un esfuerzo por impulsar desde lo local una agenda de alcance internacional.
And we can make an effort to have an agenda where we can start locally and then we can expand.
Y nuestra ciudad participa en 2 programas de colaboración internacional en materia urbana.
Our city is participating in 2 programs at urban level.
la iniciativa de 100 ciudades resilientes de Fundación Rockefeller
the 100 Resilient Cities by the Rockefeller Foundation,
y una recientemente creada de cooperación internacional con la Unión Europea.
and one recently created by the European Union.
Así es que estamos enfocados en la construcción de un plan con una visión de largo plazo para nuestra ciudad y con toda la disposición de aprender y compartir con otras ciudades del mundo.
So we are focusing on expanding
Concentrados en
to
aprender
concentrate in what we're trying to do with a long-term plan to do it.
y trabajar con el resto de las ciudades, porque como aquí lo decía el alcalde de Chicago, tenemos nosotros que alinear una visión de todo el planeta para contribuir a mejorar.
We can work with the other mayors, as my colleague, Mayor Emanuel said, that we can work in cooperation and have a long-term plan for whatever we want to
But just
do.
to follow up quickly, in Colombia, have you seen climate change in your time as mayor? And is your city really experiencing this in real time right now?
Sí, desde luego, tengo 2 años como alcalde.
Of
y
course,
hemos
I have 2 years as a
experimentado
mayor.
Los impactos que ha tenido la naturaleza, huracanes se han presentado recientemente y creo que tenemos que, no importa de qué tamaño sea nuestra ciudad, todos tenemos que empezar a trabajar en la construcción de un plan con esta visión de largo plazo y entender que lo que hagamos en Colima tiene una repercusión en el planeta y lo que se haga en otros lugares del mundo nos está afectando. Por eso es importante que estemos en este tipo de mesas.
Es una grande palabra.
Oh, palabra, right? So in my 2 years as a mayor, I have seen the changes, especially with the volcanoes, earthquakes, and other natural catastrophes that had happened in my, even though it's a small state, it's a small city, but it's still there's something that we can contribute and we can see that we can make changes. Of course, at long term, that's the thing that we can work it out.
You know, I mean, Mayor Plan's been only mayor for 9 days, and she's seen climate change. So just
A month.
Oh, sorry. They had 9 days in my notes. Mayor Bowes, you alluded to the fact that Washington, D.C. won this lead platinum for a city. So talk about some of the specific things that you've put in place that generated that award. What are you doing? And I want to talk now concrete things. What are people doing?
Sure. So let me start with some concrete. We talked, and for many years we put in place green building standards, and I'm going to forget the number of buildings that we have that meet those standards that have really set us out and set us apart from other cities. And so when you go around our built environment, you will find a lot of sustainable building practices that private and public parts of the building environment have focused on. Since I've been mayor, we've also been very focused on how we use energy and especially how we power our own buildings. So we entered into a pretty phenomenal wind agreement, which will allow us to power about a quarter of our buildings just using this renewable energy source. We've also been very focused on solar and how we're not only going to use solar for our government buildings, but how we have our residents adopting solar. And for a long time, solar had been an option for people of means. And we have focused now on how we can get solar on lower income residential units, multifamily units, but also for the single homeowner. And we're really seeing more and more people being able to adopt solar in our city. And it's also a way, because you'll frequently hear people criticize or not want to adopt renewable practices because they think it's more expensive. But we're also focused on how we can use it as a workforce training tool and train our residents for those green jobs that we're creating.
Fantastic. Mayor Roberts, what about in Montreal?
In Vancouver, yeah, we started with putting together an action plan. We set a goal when I came in as mayor 9 years ago to be the greenest city in the world by 2020, and that's sort of we think of it as a decathlon, as an Olympic city. You got to score high and right across the board. You can't blow it in any of the specific, whether it's green buildings or clean transportation, energy use, local food. You have to do well on metrics across the board. So having a plan that has had massive engagement and inclusion of the whole population and people understand what the goal is and where we're headed. Having targets that you measure to is really critical, and then rolling out the actions as urgently as possible. On the actions side of things, green buildings are our number one source of emissions and energy use, and fossil fuel use, natural gas in our case. We have the greenest building code in North America because we control it at a local level, which is really important. And our industry has actually been fantastic at adopting technologies, being innovators, driving the pace. They see the savings. We estimate by 2050, it'll be $1,000 a household saved in energy costs every year because of our green building code.
And are you seeing jobs flow out of this as well?
And that's the side of it that is, it gets generally in the background with the climate change conversation, but massive new economy that is being is growing with 50% growth of green jobs in the time that I've been mayor, and that's clean tech, renewable energy, green buildings, clean transportation, great startups, and utilities switching over. So it's creating a lot of economic opportunity and transition, and that's the key pieces. We have to figure out how we transition all of the workers who are working in fossil fuels, who are working in industries that are polluting and damaging the planet. But the good news is we have a lot of jobs to create in doing that work. It's going to be a huge opportunity, and it is. And in many of our cities, it's a driver of job growth.
Fantastic. Mayor Palm.
Well, I got to say, looking at what Vancouver's been doing in the last years is very inspiring. Montreal just joined the C40 a year ago, and so it was about time. And now we need to make sure that we're able to keep up, and so we have a lot of homeworks to do. And so we've been working on an inventory of our GHG emission to see where we're at. One of the area so we've been doing a good job so far, but one of the area that is the most problematic is everything related to transport. If we want to fight greenhouse gas emission, or if we want to reduce it, we need to talk about transport, and that is a huge issue. And this is something that during my campaign, so yes, I got elected a month ago, but it was, and my whole campaign was about bringing a very bold idea on how we should invest more money, more energy into big public transport projects. Because if we don't do it, then how are we going to get to that? The status quo is not possible anymore. But the fact that there's a lot of, in Quebec, in Montreal, there's always more and more cars, whatever we do. And though we need to continue to work on the other areas, that is such a big, important one. Yeah. And so in Canada, we have a window of opportunity in terms of financing, and some of the Canadian government is willing to support public transport infrastructure project. And so this is something that the different mayors have been working together in Canada to say, we need to invest. We need to make sure that we can, if we really want to take this seriously, well, and reach our objectives, then transport to me is a huge piece of it.
Si bien nuestra ciudad es una pequeña ciudad de 150,000 habitantes,
our city is only 150,000 people.
Y no tiene los grandes problemas de ciudades tan importantes y grandes como las de mis colegas.
And it does not have the big problems that the cities of my colleagues have.
Sí estamos trabajando en mejorar tres aspectos. Uno es el tratamiento de los residuos sólidos.
So we want to deal with waste management.
El otro es un proceso para sustituir nuestro sistema de alumbrado público.
The process to substitute the public electricity
con la
system.
Con la intención de poder abastecer nuestra fuente de energía a través de energías limpias.
To be able to do clean energy to sustain our city.
En una primera etapa en el alumbrado público y después también las viviendas y la energía de toda la ciudad.
First, we could start with the public lighting, and then we can go for the housing. We can actually plan to do that also.
Y también, bueno, nuestra ciudad tiene 5 kilómetros de ancho por 5 kilómetros de largo.
And our city is 5,000 kilometers wide by 5 kilometers wide by 5 kilometers long.
Así es que queremos presentar un programa ambicioso de transporte público que nos ayude a sacar carros de la calle.
So we want to present an ambitious program so we can remove cars from the streets.
Fantastic. Well, let's pick up on that a little. Mayor Bowser, we live in Bethesda, My daughters grew up there, but my youngest daughter lives on 13th and S now, married.
Good.
All her friends want to live downtown.
As they should.
We're just feeding it.
No cars.
And their friends, I think, could never imagine like living out way now in the suburbs. So how is that affecting density, urban planning,
Sure.
and all of your clean energy initiatives?
Well, certainly, we are growing very fast. So Washington, D.C. is a city of 680,000 people. We've been smaller and we've been larger. And right now, we're growing very rapidly. About 900 people are net added to our population every single month. And our city has changed in ways. I frequently say Washington, D.C. is not your grandfather's Washington. It's not just federal buildings. It's not just people coming in to work for the federal government and going out to Bethesda or Rockville, but people live in all 8 wards of our city. Our restaurant scene is booming. Our tech scene is booming. So in other words, museum scene is fantastic. And we are, people live in places they didn't used to. They work in places they didn't used to. And they entertain and recreate in places that they didn't used to. So all of these have been challenges to how people get around. But as a mayor, this is a good challenge to have. Because of our growth, we are able to make the types of investments in our people, in jobs and workforce training, and in looking ahead to what our economy will be because of that growth. So we're all challenged to manage it. We've been focused, as my colleagues have said, on a regional transportation system, which is now middle-aged, that we need to invest in and make better. But locally, we've made the decision that we have to rely on ourselves and our footprint. So what can we better do with our capacity? What can we do with our bus system, with dedicated bus lanes, with our own streetcar network? What can we do to make our road network better accommodate bicycles and vehicles? What can we do to get people to share the ride? What are we doing with all our ride sharing services? So we have really the challenge of saying, just within, if we didn't have to rely on regional transportation, what can we produce within our city limits using our city bus and our networks to move people around is important. But I'll just add, it's also important to how we grow as a region, not just DC, but Maryland and Virginia suburbs, a $4 million person metropolitan area. And how are we going to connect to the rest of the United States and North America for that matter? That's why we're so interested in connecting to Baltimore and New York City and even to the West. So we're really focused on what those new technologies like the Hyperloop could mean for DC.
Just a quick follow-up on that, and I want each of the mayors to answer this as well. So 2 things that I really noticed change in our city. One is more bikes, and bike sharing, and more Uber, and Lyft.
Yes.
And so how do those present environmental challenges? So more people driving individual cars, and yet also more bikes. And I want everybody to talk about that.
Sure. So for us, we embrace the sharing economy in DC, because one thing I learned early on in doing this is that people are going to decide what's best. And in some cases, especially with sharing, the people got ahead of the government as it goes. But they also got ahead of government regulations. So we were catching up when it came to ride sharing. And for us, Uber and Lyft were a challenge to the taxi cab system that had become really unresponsive and not serving any of us well. And now what we see was just in the Post today, and I've heard Mayor Emanuel talk about it, is now they're becoming a challenge to transit systems. So I think that this challenge is...
In what way?
Because people are going to choose what's more affordable, more comfortable, and more convenient. And that is what ride sharing is presenting. So the cheaper ride sharing becomes, the more people are going to choose it.
Over metro.
As transit becomes more expensive, more unreliable, and less comfortable, they'll leave it. It's just that simple. And so we have to make sure that we're making the types of investment in our public transit systems that are going to attract riders. You can't make people choose bad service, and they're always going to choose better service. And so that is our challenge when we're talking about Uber and Lyft in our public transit system.
Great. Mayor Robertson, Vancouver, how are these?
Well, land use and transportation are linked inextricably. We have to do everything we can to make sure that all the land use planning, where people live, is connected to how they can get around efficiently and affordably. So that's a challenge in Vancouver. We have very limited geography.
And you also have a lot of young people wanting to move in the city.
A lot of young people coming into the city. Yeah, the growth has been very intense. About 60,000 people a year coming into Vancouver. We're at 2.5 million now, and we don't have more land to use.
Right.
We can only go up at this point. We've protected, previous generations protected our watersheds for great clean water. They protected agricultural land, so we have local food. So we've had wise choices made for many years on land use. We've concentrated our growth downtown and along the major transit corridors and rapid transit in particular. So good decisions, and that's enabled people to make really good choices on transportation in the time that I've been mayor. So since 2008, we've seen we had set a goal of getting over half the people out of cars. We can't add more cars. We've got too much traffic congestion. It's an expensive way to get around. So we said we've got to focus on transit, walking, and biking. Walking is the top priority.
How do you enhance that?
Well, that's the land use side. What you build has to be complete communities. People can walk to transit, or they can walk to work. Bikes have become a huge, important part of our network now. Over 10% of people commute on bicycles in Vancouver, which is #1 in North America.
Wow.
We're behind the European cities on this, but for North America, we're all catching up, and all of our cities are working on this. Montreal was a pioneer on this with bike shares. First bike shares come from Montreal originally, and we're all doing that. So, but people now in Vancouver, over half of our population now uses walk, bike, and transit to get around. We beat that goal in 2015. It was a 2020 target. And that's just people making good choices and having the right transportation options for people that are available. So I think in the next phase of it, we got to get all the cars off of fossil fuels. And so we're really focused on the electric vehicle charging ecosystem. It's mandatory in new buildings to have charging infrastructure. New homes have to have that. So we want to make sure as the market delivers the technology to go clean, we've got what we need in the public realm that's there. And we need to push the pace in terms of making sure that developers are including that infrastructure along with building green buildings and zero emission buildings. In Vancouver's case, by 2030, all buildings, new buildings have to be zero emissions.
Wow.
And it's 70% by 2020, 90% by 2025. So we've sent the market signals on buildings and transportation, said this is where we're going. We're going to 100% renewable energy in Vancouver. We're at 31% right now, thanks to hydroelectric power. But we're going all the way there, and then the market has time to change and adapt, and local companies have the opportunity to innovate and meet that market demand.
Mayor Plum, same questions.
Yes, I can definitely relate to what Mayor Bowser is saying about how we need to adapt to how we, there has to be different options. We want mobility. That's a good way to reach our objectives. But also the quality and what people want might be different from what we expected or what we have to offer, and we need to adapt to that. Though I'm a big believer in public transport, big projects, we need to also make sure that there's other options for people. And it's the same thing in Quebec, where some of the laws coming from another level of government is not following the market, whether if I talk about car sharing or other types of transport. But definitely we need to make sure that those options are there. And for public transport, we need to adapt. It has to be flexible, it has to be fast, it has to be comfortable. This is a big issue in Montreal where it's kind of getting old, some of the buses and even the metro system. So it's not as comfortable, so it's not as interesting for people. So we need to adapt. And one of the things maybe I want to throw out there is that for us in Montreal, something that has been very important for us is always to engage the public, the different actors from the public sphere, public I'm sorry, I'm looking for my words.
Sector, yeah.
So to work with, with the actors from the city, but also with businesses, consulting the population so we can grow together and come up with a better understanding of what are the needs. So we decided to create a climate change adaptation plan. And so we did this huge consultation in Montreal to make sure that we're able to hear what are the concerns. Is there anything we're missing? And then from there, it's helpful. It helps to bring solution forward based on what people have been saying. So when people say, you know what, City of Montreal, you got to be, you need to fight GHG more. Well, ultimately, it's also about saying, well, listen, guys, everybody wants to use their car. So how about we invest in different options? But it's also a good way when you consult the population to raise awareness and make decisions that are connected to the reality.
Very interesting. Do you see young people migrating to the city? Do you have Uber there? Are these same challenges in a smaller, Mexican city today?
Sí, definitivamente la tecnología juega un papel hoy muy importante en los temas de movilidad.
Definitely, the technology plays a big role in this part.
Y lo va a jugar de manera más relevante en el futuro inmediato.
And it's going to be more relevant in the future.
Los vehículos no tripulados, un sistema diferente al que hoy tenemos
Than
en
no
la
driver's
ciudad,
vehicles, a different system.
seguramente pronto será una realidad.
Probably in the future, soon will be a reality. Hopefully soon will be a reality.
Y tenemos que empezar a pensar en ciudades que se mueven de una manera más eficiente,
And we have to believe in cities that could move in a more efficient way
con el uso de nuevas tecnologías.
with the use of new technologies.
Y si logramos hacer que la gente pueda caminar, como decía mi colega de Vancouver,
And as my colleague from Vancouver is saying, that if we can make people to walk more
andar en bicicleta,
and use bikes,
usar menos el vehículo,
use the vehicles less,
seguramente podemos construir ciudades que se disfruten más para la persona.
surely we can have cities that can be shared, that can be enjoyed by all.
Terrific, thanks. Well, we have time for some questions from the audience. I know there's a lot of people engaged in this issue out there, and so I want to invite you in. We have people with mics, and who has a question, please raise your hand. Right over there.
Yeah, I'm Serge Medina, Mayor of Imperial Beach, California. It's great to be here. And we were, along with Marin and San Mateo, one of the first cities and counties to sue 35 fossil fuel companies for causing sea level rise, a story that was covered in the New York Times. I want to encourage all of you and all the mayors here to actually take these fossil fuel companies to court and basically for causing climate change and sea level rise especially. And
where does the case stand right now?
I'm sorry?
Where does the case stand right now?
It's in California court, and so we'll filing all the motions. But
yeah.
San Francisco and Oakland did it as well, but we're really encouraging, especially cities like Vancouver that are, like us, are dealing with king tides and big surf and more storm surge, as well as Virginia and cities around the country, but very important.
Very interesting.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, over here, young lady. Hold on one second, because this is being streamed, so.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about competitive advantage? You've talked about reducing fuel bills by $1,000 a household, which is a major draw. Right. Having clean water, if your industry, is a major draw. Mm-hmm. So are we going to begin to see a sort of a disparity between dirty cities and clean cities, and the clean cities actually marketing it as a pro-business strategy?
Everybody take a crack. Why don't you, Mayor Bowser, why don't you start? And then
I hope that we don't, and that all cities see the advantages, and also see that we have proven that it's not a competitive disadvantage to ingress in green strategy. So you can have a very aggressive green building code and still attract business and people who want to develop.
That having the green approach gives you a competitive advantage, that is a plus. So we're going to see cities that aren't getting on the bandwagon and seeing the future, having sea level rise destroy things, being vulnerable to every weather disaster, actually falling down, while the green cities are actually the plus.
I would say I agree. I think that is going to be a challenge going forward. They're definitely, cities do compete for talent and investment. not totally directly. I think we all see each other as more colleagues and who cooperate and collaborate. But that said, the private sector has to choose where to locate and where to do business. And so there is a level of competition, and livability is a huge issue. I know cities in China right now are really struggling. China and India have unbelievably bad air pollution, water pollution. And so they've lost lots of those who can afford to move their money and their families out. Cities like Vancouver, Sydney, San Francisco, Pacific Rim in particular have attracted a lot of immigrants from wealthy immigrants from Chinese and Indian cities where they have the option to move. And it creates a challenge in cities that are affected by this, because you get the influx of a whole bunch of global capital that affect the real estate industry. The population impacts are real. So we have real challenges with growth and absorbing the wealth and growth that's coming with that, and keeping the city livable. We want to keep the quality of life right up there for everyone who lives here, and we don't want to displace people who live in the city. And young people growing up want a future in the city, don't want to be pushed out. So it is creating consequences for sure, and we have to think those through and work together. And that's why I think a lot of us work together as a network, because we don't want to see winners and losers in this. We want, there is a giant migration into cities globally, and we all need to reinvent and rebuild and transform our cities collectively.
Who else out there? All the way back. We'll hit the back of the room. Young lady back there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I thought it was quite interesting that the mayor with the longest tenure was the one to mention land use, because land use is one of the most important things we can do to improve the lives and livelihoods of individuals who are at risk from both coastal flooding, riverine flooding, and wildfires. And I would just like to understand better, for those of you who are, potentially up for re-election, how do you think about these very long-term issues like land use changes that would actually mean that people couldn't live in what will soon be too risky places that would really cause disbenefits for everyone in the city because of the tax implications of trying to bail them out?
What would be an example of that, like a coastal area or something like that? Or
Coastal area, right.
Yeah.
What? I didn't hear that.
Like a coastal area, whatnot.
Floodplain.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just jump in
go
on,
ahead. Yeah,
on the Vancouver side of things. We have raised what we call our flood control levels, so everything's basically got to be built a meter higher now. That's one piece, but we have a lot of development that is in the floodplain of the Fraser River, which is a huge wild river that comes through the city, and the ocean where it's moving in as well. So we're going to have huge infrastructure costs. We're going to have to keep it out, much as the low countries, cities like Rotterdam and Amsterdam have done for many generations. A lot of those technologies, New York is deploying a lot of those technologies. Miami is inundated. Yeah. So there are a lot of cities already having to adapt, and there have to be different land use decisions made, which typically mean concentrating the growth at higher elevations and where there's public transit, where people live. But it's really difficult to pull people off of low-lying areas. We have parts of our city that are prone to flooding already from the river, and sea level rise is going to impact them. And it's a very difficult topic to bring up. If we're thinking 50 or 100 years down the line, it looks pretty dire. And when you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of people living in those areas.
Actually, for us, it's been kind of the opposite, where during my election, there's a big green space. So Montreal is an island, like I was saying, and so there's few remained, just not a little space left, green lands left. And during the election, it was more, a lot of promoters wanted to just expand and build new houses there, where for us, for me, I was saying, no, we cannot be doing that, because this is a way it's almost like a sponge for us on the island to make sure that some of the water gets there, and also to protect. And also in Montreal, we don't necessarily have all the data to make sure that those are not floodable. No, how would you? Yeah, well, potential floods would happen in those areas. So it was interesting, because actually a lot of the citizens went behind us saying, no, we agree with you. Don't change it. Don't make it for more buildings. Let's concentrate in places where it makes sense, where there's not going to be flooding, where there's more public transport, so we don't have to transform a whole area. So for me, it's been playing in a good way, But at the same time, I haven't made let's say I have a lot of friends, but a lot of people, especially promoters, who don't like me so much these days.
Me too.
Sobre el tema me parece que tenemos dos retos importantes.
According to this theme, I think we have two struggles to meet.
El primero es evitar la expansión de nuestras ciudades, ¿no? Que sigan creciendo.
The first is to avoid the expansion of our city.
Y el segundo es que estos planes para crecer de manera vertical y utilizar mejor los espacios que ya tenemos.
And to grow vertical and to utilize the spaces that we already have.
Garantizar que los futuros gobernantes o los futuros tomadores de decisiones
To guarantee that the future governor, the future presidents or mayors,
respeten un plan con visión de largo plazo que se está construyendo.
to respect a vision of a long-term plan.
Great, thank you. Over here.
As I look around the cities, as in Chicago, you have a tremendous centralization now of the population in the downtown areas. And how are the cities going to deal with the infrastructure needs, which may be surpassed in the next 5 to 10 years, or may already be surpassed, and deal with that? It is a vertical growth, but it's a vertical growth with an infrastructure that's 100 years old.
Yes, we're very focused on it. Over the last several years, now Washington is small, very compact, only 10 by 10 square miles. And so we are, just about every part of our city is densely populated. We have some areas that are more suburban-like than others, but we're very densely populated. What we have done is really take an inventory of our infrastructure needs, and we've loaded, not the sexy part of being mayor, but we've loaded all that into a database. We understand the life cycle from roads to government buildings to the jail, you name it. We know exactly where it is in its lifespan and what the maintenance needs are and the replacement needs are. And we've added it up. So we know what it takes to get there. So over many years of budgeting, we're paying toward those infrastructure costs, maintenance and replacement costs for that infrastructure. We think this has put us, one of our best good government practices is knowing where we are with our infrastructure. So that gives us as a policymaker the decisions to make. We can budget as we go, we can borrow to get it done, or we can raise revenue to take care of it over the course of time. We think we can look at our current budgeting practices with a mix of cash and borrowing to take care of that infrastructure in a regularly scheduled process. We have one major asset that we share with Maryland and Virginia that we don't have taken care of yet, and that's our metro system. And we're still looking for ways to come up with a dedicated source of revenue collectively to take care of that.
Anybody else want to take a crack at that?
I'll jump in. Yeah, in terms of, I think the big challenge that we have is that 90% of tax dollars in Canada go to federal and provincial governments. So at the city level, we get 10%, generally through property taxes. And we manage about 60% of the infrastructure. But barely, and that's with a lot of creativity and a lot of relentless effort, but it's a very difficult formula right now for new infrastructure. We have to, you're exactly right, we need massive investments in transit infrastructure to get people around, which are costly, and we need obviously the water, the utilities, the water and sewer are critical to the survival of a city. The electrical grid is a key piece, and I think this is one that's catching up with a lot of us. As we electrify everything, literally, we're going to need a lot more electricity infrastructure, and that has not been, I think, the scale of what has to happen next for all of our transportation to be powered by renewable electricity, for our buildings to be heated and cooled using electricity that's renewable. That's you know, it's going to take a couple of decades. We have to start now, and we have to make significant investments in upgrading and improving that infrastructure because it's so concentrated, and particularly in downtowns.
So go ahead.
I left off one thing, and I know the mayors from Canada will chime into this, because Canadians have been very good at another source for us for infrastructure, and that's public-private partnerships. And we're focused on how, because some of the things that we have to do, it makes sense to encourage private sector investment. We're looking at that, for example, for how we're going to rebuild our jail. How we're going to replace 75,000 streetlights. Can we attract a private sector partner so that we're still getting the public benefit, still a public asset, but we may use some private sector dollars to help us get there.
Even in the museum space.
Even in the museum space. We do it quite a lot with economic development
My wife's building a
projects.
museum thanks to the mayor in Washington. Go ahead.
Bueno, por lo que veo, los problemas de la mala distribución del presupuesto no son exclusivos de mi país.
So what I can see now is that the issues with that budget distribution and budget problems is not just my problem. I can see.
Yo creo que ahí tenemos un trabajo muy importante que hacer para lograr una mejor distribución del presupuesto hacia las ciudades.
So I believe that's what we have to work on, to find a better way to distribute the funds, the budgets for the cities.
Por ejemplo, nosotros tenemos que reponer el 80% de la red hidráulica de nuestra ciudad.
For example, we have to replace the water system, the 80% of our water systems.
Y no tenemos un solo peso para eso.
We do not have a single peso.
So what do you do, Mayor?
Yeah.
Se va deteriorando y se va haciendo vieja.
It keeps deteriorating, it keeps getting more older.
Can you raise taxes? Does the federal government give you
Yo
any help?
pienso que tenemos que discutir en el Congreso y con el gobierno federal este tema de manera muy seria para que se dote de los recursos.
I believe that we have to actually go to the federal government and go to Congress and dialogue and talk to them that this is something, it's a must, they have to be done.
Y poner este tema sobre la mesa para lograr los recursos que nos permitan hacer inversiones para reponer toda esa infraestructura.
Put this issue on the table and just tell them that it's a great idea to use the private sector to do the water, deal with the water issues.
Interesting. Let's go somewhere,
More
right here.
hands now.
Yeah, it's great. Well, you've just stimulated all. It's a great compliment to you. Right here, young lady.
Presupuesto.
Right, no, right. Actually, the young lady there, and then we'll come back to you. Third row, then we'll come back.
I'm going to say first in Spanish. Le quería preguntar, conforme las iniciativas de educación para, sobre todo en el área de las escuelas o a nivel de los ciudadanos como tal, ¿qué iniciativas hay en México que nosotros podamos quizás asimilar in Chicago? Basically, I'm asking, what kind of initiatives do you have from an educational point of view? We are actually involved with one of the schools creating an eco-council, and I'm curious about
Teaching
you
about
guys.
the environment issues or
Right,
climate issues?
but mostly from the educational point of view,
Right.
especially like
Interesting.
primary
Good
school.
question. Yeah.
Sí, nuestras ciudades.
I'd like to hear everybody talk about that, but go ahead. Why don't you start?
No, sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't
No,
see
you
it.
go. No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Ladies first.
If it was addressed in Spanish, you get to go first.
Yeah,
It's the rule here.
Colima forma parte de una red internacional de ciudades educadoras.
So Colima is part of an international rate of schools.
No, ciudades educadoras.
I'm sorry. No, it's educated cities.
The photographers
Ya
always
necesito dos traductores. Y estamos trabajando por fomentar el tema de la cultura de la paz. Creemos que es muy importante trabajar desde la educación en cambiar la manera en la que la gente hoy se relaciona.
We think about education for peace. I'm sorry. I'm too hot. ¿Lo puede repetir, por favor,
Sí,
alcalde?
estamos trabajando en la cultura de la paz.
We are working on the culture for peace.
Que es una de las prioridades que tenemos en una región en donde la violencia y la actividad
That
criminal
we're
se han
working is one
incrementado.
of our priorities because of the region where we're in is violence,
violence prone.
yes.
Great, thank you. Mayor Bowser, what's going on in DC schools around this issue?
It's a great question because the kids, this is an area where the kids are far more ahead of the adults, and they're teaching, and we rely actually a lot on the kids to change the behavior of their parents. And one of those things that we've been focused on, for example, is how we're composting and managing food waste. That's a big initiative that we're pushing now that's new, where we have put out all kinds of food waste drop-off points. We even had over the holidays a composting initiative around pumpkins, and it was the kids who was taking this information back to their parents. Part of our focus on young people is through one of our summer jobs initiatives. My director of energy and the environment is here, Tommy Wells. He takes a number of kids who have expressed interest in sustainability and the environment and is bringing them in to show them the jobs that are going to be related to climate, fighting climate change. We are very focused on making sure that a diverse set of kids is interested in the environment and fighting climate change as well. And we think we can play a unique role in that, and really getting them engaged during the summers, and they're taking the lessons learned in a professional setting back to their studies when they go back to school.
Please go ahead, ma'am.
Well, I mean, it's in Quebec, in Canada, so at the municipal level, we're not part of anything related to education, something at another level. But at the same time, again, schools are on our territories, and we have all the families and kids. So for me, as the mayor of Montreal, what I find one good way to make sure that everyone's involved. I talked earlier about the consultation, but it's also about some of the very simple project we put together that involves kids. For example, in Montreal, something is very helpful is how we enlarge some of the sidewalks, and we green those sidewalks as a way to make, if you cross the streets, it's safer because the time to go across is shorter, so it's good for seniors, people with disabilities, it's good for kids as well. But it's also, we try to involve the schools and the kids as well, so they can be part of how do we put more green in our city, how is this part of our environment? And as well, then we try to support as much as possible everything related to food waste as well. Those are programs that we contribute at the City of Montreal. But it is definitely, what I'm looking forward is hopefully to when we talk about consultation, it's something that I'm really attached to. And though we consult actors, well, the people in the different fields, and mostly they're adults, but kids have so much to say about how to, come up with solutions and ideas that are very simple and just make their environment and our environment better. So something that I'm hoping to go for more.
Back there.
Thanks. Thank you for all of that you're doing in your leadership. I really appreciate it. And Tom, your voice has been so critical on this issue as well. What I think is so missing is, especially in the United States, the other half of our political parties don't acknowledge climate change. So what can your voices as local leaders do to influence, at least to get an acknowledgement of the problem, and just move beyond this debate and denial and just say, here's a problem, how are we going to solve it, and move the conversation forward. And the second part of that, there's some discussion about state versus federal funding. Is there a way to even tie that to participation in solutions? So, for example, in a state like Florida, where you have a governor who flat out denies and even censors his own staff to say, we're not going to talk about climate change. If you're not participating in the solutions, well, when you get hit with a Class 5 hurricane or are dealing with sea level rise, then don't ask me as a taxpayer in Chicago to pay for your seawalls because you're not doing anything. In fact, you're being, you're stopping progress. So you you tie your participation to, you can only be eligible for federally funded FEMA climate-related disasters if you have an RPS or are doing certain benchmark things to acknowledge climate change. I don't know, just an idea.
That's a very interesting idea. It'll never happen now, but it's a great idea. It goes back to the point Yeah, it goes back to the point over here about people suing, it's very interesting that we could be heading down that road. Anyone want to take, just to condense what was a great question, but can you as mayors also bring, help heal this crazy debate? I mean, it's hard to talk people out of something they haven't actually been talked into because it's really a more cultural thing, but I mean, what can you do on that thing?
I would just say, and in my experience with American mayors of both parties, I belong to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and it's nonpartisan, Democrats and Republicans alike. And I'm more optimistic about Republican mayors than I am as you go up the chain.
Because they're more reality-based.
They are, rubber meets the road politicians who have to get things done. So I think it's hard for a Republican mayor if the case can be made for something that's going to save the government money, be healthier, attract more businesses and residents. They're going to be hard pressed to walk away from it. And then they too, the governor or whomever, when they start getting pressure from the municipalities, they may be convinced on some initiative. They may not be completely change their way of thinking, but there may be one initiative that mayors collectively in a jurisdiction could move a state level representative or executive towards. And so I would really look to a collection of mayors on both sides of the aisle who may be motivated by an initiative, especially if it's bottom line oriented. If you can demonstrate how it saves money now, near term and far term, they have to listen.
When Superstorm Sandy happened, it coincided with the beginning of President Obama's second term. And if you recall, he did a tax deal then, which involved a tax hike. It was $600 billion for 10 years, or $60 billion a year. And you couldn't make this up, but the bailout for Superstorm Sandy was $60 billion. So one storm ate the entire increased tax increment for the first year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd jump in on this just saying that our networks of cities, whether they're at a local level in a region or globally, I think we're starting to have significant political influence and impact because we're working together a lot more cohesively. The U.S. Conference of Mayors has done a great job at a global level, just sending that signal that the U.S. is committed to being part of fighting climate change and committing on the Paris agreements, regardless of what the president said, and he's kind of the only one left in the world saying that at this point.
Unfortunately, lives in 1600 Pennsylvania.
Yeah, unfortunately. He's got the job that he shouldn't have, but I
just said it.
At the local level, I would say in Canada anyway, I mean, cities banded together across the country to help de-elect a conservative government that was not committed to fighting climate change. It was very much an oil and gas, fossil fuel promotion vehicle as a party, and we ran a very, very aggressive urban climate change fighting agenda, and we changed the government of Canada. And Canada went from being one of the worst at the global table to being kind of back in the game. Then again, not all the way back, because the Canadian government is still pushing pipelines. We're fighting at a local level against a pipeline from Alberta to export Alberta oil sands diluted bitumen to China, and which will pollute Chinese cities even more, so they can ship us back refined fuels. In this, some of the darker sides of globalization and the big energy question that we're grappling with. At the same time, we have to figure this out as countries, as a planet. We have to come from a place of compassion and understanding and inclusion. It can't be, pox on each of our houses because we won't be able to solve it. So the challenge that we've had, I think, and that's affecting the U.S. right now, is when it's so polarized and there isn't understanding, there isn't even a good dialogue happening between sides on an issue. We've got to get to a place where there's some shared language and understanding. I think we can do that at a local level in cities. We live together. We've got to figure it out at a local level. But the challenge is going to be scaling that up and making sure that we connect the dots from the local to national and global.
Sí, yo creo que tenemos motivos para ser optimistas también.
Do we have reasons to be optimistic?
Hoy este evento, la posibilidad de estar alcaldes de grandes ciudades
today,
pequeñas ciudades,
today at this event to be with mayors of larger cities and smaller cities
de diferentes lugares del mundo, trabajando y tomando decisiones para aportar
from different parts of the world where we can give decisions to the
tomar decisiones para, digamos, ir en la dirección contraria a la de...
We can make decisions and go maybe with a different, the contrary.
Eso me parece a mí que es una buena noticia en la que tenemos que seguir.
And I think this is a good news that we can work on it.
One last one, Craig, go ahead.
Mr. Friedman, in your November 28th article, Forget Trump and Discover the World, you did a wonderful analysis, a story about India and the whole rapid digitization that we're looking at in the world, where you said digital data is the new oil. And I was struck by that. We have to give props to, he hasn't said much from your point of view, but I think what's interesting about cities is that with benchmarking of energy data, we had an event at the Field Museum last night bringing together about 2,000 members of the Chicago community on this topic, and we brought environmental justice issues. We thought we'd have 300, 2,000 showed up. That was social media. Wow. When Barack Obama ran for president from Chicago in 2007, it was June of 2007 that the iPhone was invented. It was actually, so this January, so 10 was actually, it was actually launched in June, invented in January. So it's been 10 years. So 10 years hence, you talked about digitization and the ability to pay for things, and we're using these tools that everyone has a computer. I'd like to ask you to think about, as mayors, how do you take advantage of your populace having so much more tools, and what can you do to better arm them, if you will, with good arms that can help them solve problems at the speed and scale that we need to solve them?
Very good question. I know in Louisville, the mayor there has begun a citizen scientist program where actually young people are given inhalers, and they go out every morning, and their inhalers connected to the cloud digitally, and then they map out that day the best air quality in the city each day. Anybody have any thoughts on that, or because I think that's very important. Once you start measuring things and then putting it up on a dashboard, people can really start to respond.
I think that the possibilities are just, I think we've only scratched the surface to answer your question about what we're relying on individual residents to do to help us solve problems. One of the things that I started our administration off with was how can we use kind of the civic hacking capacity and coding capacity to work on human services problems. We had seen a lot of the civic hacking focused on transportation and bicycling and things like that, but nobody was focused on how can I stop a mom from standing in line in the cold to wait for her child care benefits or her food stamps. And we still haven't really solved that problem. We just had one of our stats recently where I charged the team with coming up with a solution. Why do we have all of our multi-family residential buildings have individual trash haulers, for example? It's a sharing problem, and we need to focus kind of our civic hacking capacity less on things that have an economic benefit and more on things that have a human services benefit. And so we're trying to shift that. And one way that we can help is kind of change the way we do business. A lot of times in government, we hold all our data like this, and we make you FOIA it to actually see it. So we have to shift our default to sharing data. And so recently, we came up with a citywide data policy where we're really trying to set the switch. So the default is to share. And then frequently ask our residents to help us solve problems. But I really like to get people focused on the human services side and help us solve some of those problems.
This has been a great panel. Unfortunately, I've got to take a plane, and so it's now over. But I thank you all. I've actually learned a lot, both from all that you've said and the great questions from the audience. So thank them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Tom.